All right, this is going to be video number 4 in our checklist series of the 6 things that I look for before investing in a stock. And this video is going to cover moats, barriers to entry. And I'm going to go through a few different examples and talk about some different ways to think about moats and barriers to entry that may be a little bit counterintuitive as well. But basically, there's kind of sort of obvious types of things that can produce a barrier to entry in a marketplace. Typically, they're regulatory structures. So for example, in the banking industry, we have a lot more regulations than we did before the great financial crisis. So now the moats are much bigger and more difficult to get across in the banking industry than they were before. And so that's bullish for the existing bank stocks that are out there already. For example, pharmaceuticals also, there hasn't necessarily been changes here, but it's always been pretty expensive and difficult in terms of cost and regulatory barriers to get drugs into the marketplace, get new meds into the marketplace. So the pharmaceutical industry is a natural kind of oligopoly with pretty big barriers to entry as well. So these are regulatory examples. But you can have other things that can make up a barrier to entry. So, for example, you can have technology or sort of a set of patents or intellectual property. You can also have brands. So, in the consumer products marketplace, basically the major brands have created their own, you could call it a type of intellectual property sort of, that has been built over many decades of advertising and marketing, and known brands have their own barrier to competition. Let's see, channels of distribution can be another kind of semi-visible example, like companies like Walmart or Coca-Cola. They have kind of a distribution system that is very difficult to replicate, and they also maybe have slotting fees or slotting access in major retailers. Coca-Cola would be an example here. Obviously, Walmart would be on the opposite side of that. But that can be a barrier to entry too. Some new drink maker may not be able to get shelf space at major retailers, whereas Coca-Cola could. So this is another thing to think about that may not be front of mind in the marketplace, but it exists kind of behind the scenes. Then there can be something like a structural monopoly, and that would be something like a utility, where you're not going to put two utility companies and their power plants right next to each other with replicated infrastructure and power lines. That would be a waste of capital. So typically, utility companies, power companies, are regulated monopolies, and they have an automatic barrier to entry because of that. Okay, so these are just different things to think about. I would say also, some industries, there is so much lag between new production and new capacity that hits the marketplace. You can actually have sort of structural barriers to entry because of sort of temporal reasons. And I would say, for example, in the mining industry, when we go through, say, a commodity boom for copper, which was what we're experiencing right now, the lead time or the number of years that it takes to bring new capacity to the marketplace, even though there may not be a barrier to opening a new copper mine, the amount of time that it takes from opening a mine to production of ore and smelting of that ore could be 10 years. So you can have sort of a temporal barrier to entry to think about as well in an industry like that. Okay? Now, let me go through a couple specific examples just to drive home the point. And a really helpful example to think about is the tobacco industry. So, you have Philip Morris International. There's a few different tobacco companies. Back in from the 1970s to 80s and then into the early 90s, there was successive reductions in these companies' ability to advertise. And part of this was to stop kids getting tempted into smoking. It was kind of a very, very good reason, but it had an unintended after effect. So today, it's basically impossible to advertise or market a tobacco company. So how does a new tobacco company get access to the marketplace? No one is ever going to know about them because you cannot advertise. And so this actually creates kind of natural monopolies or natural duopolies in the tobacco industry. So Philip Morris International, or ticker Altria, ticker MO, these are sort of interesting natural duopolies. There's a few other tobacco companies that are in the marketplace, but there probably never will be a new tobacco company because of these limits on advertising. So this is sort of an interesting kind of regulatory type of barrier to entry that was created unintentionally by regulators by limiting advertising, and it prevents any new company from entering a marketplace. So this is a way to think about a barrier to entry that's actually very bullish for the existing companies that are already out there. Also, Walmart is kind of interesting as an example of both a barrier to entry and a lack of a barrier to entry. Walmart obviously is a dominant retailer. Their size and scale, their skill at logistics, their distribution, these are advantages they have that create barriers to entry. However, they don't really have protection against disintermediation from online retailing. And they have their own online retailing site as well, but the Amazonification of retail is still going to affect them. So sometimes you can think that you have a great barrier to entry, but it kind of can evaporate if there's some other technological solution that can help other companies enter into your marketplace. So you have to be mindful of that. No barrier to entry necessarily is permanent because there can be some escape route or some access point that you hadn't thought of or that hadn't existed before. And the sort of internetization or the Amazonification of retail is a good example of that. Okay? And then last thought I'll leave you with is just a thought about cryptocurrency. Is there a barrier to entry in the cryptocurrency world? And this is it's an interesting topic too, because the answer in one level is no, because anybody can start a new cryptocurrency, and there are lots and lots of cryptos out there, and there's more every month or every so often there's new coins coming out. However, the original kind of dominant cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, has sort of a type of first mover advantage, kind of like a brand awareness, if you will, and they're significantly larger than all the other cryptocurrencies out there. And so there's sort of kind of a first mover brand awareness layer of barrier to entry from being the dominant cryptocurrency. So while there may not be barriers to entry to form other cryptocurrencies, the main one, the sort of generally accepted one, because it was first, because it was the biggest, because it has certain kind of backing of major corporations, for example, certain level of adoption that is significantly greater than all the other cryptocurrencies, that could consist of a barrier to entry. So there's puts and takes in the case of crypto, and it does get you to think about barriers to entry in kind of a more nuanced way. Okay? So these are just some thoughts to look at. You want to see a moat and a barrier to entry before you invest in a company, and you want to make sure that those barriers to entry are sustainable. All right? So I hope these videos help, and as always, thanks for watching.